Hello, everybody. Good afternoon to those of you in Seattle. Hello and welcome to those of you in the East Coast and different time zones. My name is Margaret Heldring and I am with Grandmothers Against Gun Violence. We are so delighted to welcome you to this program this evening. And we are honored to be doing this program once again in partnership with MOHAI, which is the Museum of History and Industry, for those of you that may not be familiar with Seattle and our treasures like MOHAI. This is the third in our series of grand conversations. And as we begin, we'd like to take just a brief moment to acknowledge that we in the Puget Sound region stand on the historic and contemporary lands and shores of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and other Coast Salish nations. We honor the endurance of the Duwamish people who still live here. We'd also like to take just a few seconds to acknowledge that yesterday, once again, we as a nation have experienced a school shooting in St. Louis, and our deepest condolences to the families and friends and teachers and classmates of those two who were killed and those who were injured. Every shooting is painful. Every shooting is also deepens our resolve to stay with this work and seek solutions. This series of grand conversations explores critical issues in gun violence, its prevention, policies, and politics. Our first conversation, we asked what to do about guns in America. In our second grand conversation, we explored painfully and deeply the impact of gun violence on children. Today, we are considering women and guns. We aim to bring together in these conversations people with different exposure, expertise, and often even points of view. Among our goals, our objectives, is a search for common ground among the different voices that can lead to meaningful solutions. In December of this year, on December 12th exactly, the nation will remember the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, December 14th, 2012. A tragedy that galvanized public action on behalf of gun violence solution, public action that clearly preceded political action. But here in Washington State, we are very grateful and proud of the work of our state legislature and many of our leaders who are working together to solve gun violence and prevent it. Today, 10 years later, the gun violence situation in this country is a story with two storylines. One is the growth of the movement. All around the country, many different voices, all with a singular objective. The second storyline is the painful, tragic one, which is the growth increase of gun violence, firearm deaths in this country. Today, we're going to explore the dynamic of women and guns. And with this, I am really delighted to welcome back as our moderator for the second time with us, Naomi Ishisaka from the Seattle Times. Naomi is, I want to make sure I have this completely correct, the assistant managing editor for diversity and inclusion and the social justice columnist for the Seattle Times. In addition to being an award-winning journalist, she is also a photographer, and we have really enjoyed her generous time with us to moderate this. And Naomi will take it from here and introduce our wonderful panelists. So thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for giving your time now to deepen your knowledge and renew your activism to end gun violence. Naomi.
Thank you so much, Margaret. It's wonderful to be here again. The last conversation I had with this group was so powerful and moving, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what our incredible slate of panelists has to share with us tonight. So I just wanted to quickly introduce them, although they'll be telling you a little bit more about themselves when they talk with you. But first, want to introduce the Seattle Police Chief, Adrian Diaz. And we are really appreciative of him joining us tonight. We also have Greg Jackson, who's the Executive Director of the Community Justice Action Fund, as well as Deborah Azrael, who's the Director of Research at the Harvard Injury Control Research Center, and Ralph Fascitelli, who's the former Executive Director of Washington CeaseFire and is a smart technology expert and proponent. And did I miss anyone, Margaret?
I'm going to have to interrupt for just one moment. I just got a word that the MOHAI screen is stuck on Give to MOHAI. So Anthony, if you could maybe take a look at that. Sorry to interrupt, Naomi, but
Oh, okay. We can't see what you see, so we're just.
I don't see that either. I just got a text to that effect. So let me hear. Let's just pause 1 second to
Okay.
Anthony can address that issue.
Maybe he doesn't.
It'll be like a podcast.
Yeah.
Which wouldn't be all that bad, but
No, it would not.
Anthony, are you with us? Sorry, everybody. Thank you for your patience. You want to see and hear this incredible set of panelists. You really do. Anthony, are you with us?
Whatever it is, it's on the back end, that's all they do. They probably just need to go through.
I can hear noises that they're working on it. Technology.
We should have it corrected now. Hopefully everything's good to go now.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Naomi, back to you. I apologize for the interruption.
Okay. And I see somebody has already utilized the Q&A function. So excellent. I guess I don't need to give my about that just yet. So we wanted to get started with Deborah. So Deborah, if you could take it away from here.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Good evening. Anthony, you are going to be showing my slides, or perhaps you already are. Can people see the slides? All right. Well, I'm gonna assume that people can, and when I say next slide, the slides will actually advance. So hopefully, someone will let me know if that's not the case. So in any case, good evening. It's evening where I am here in Boston, and thanks very much for having me. As Naomi told you, my name is Deb Azrael, and I'm a researcher at the Harvard Injury Control Research Center at the Harvard School of Public Health, where I've done work about firearm-related issues for going on for the past 30 years or so. So my brief for this talk, our brief for this evening, is a pretty broad one, right? Women and guns. And I found myself, okay, audience says they can't see the slides. All right, well, we'll do.
Here they are. Here they are, Deb.
Okay, dandy. And now I have to just get back to my, hold on 1 second.
Can you see them now to the audience? Thank you for your Q&As saying that you can't see them. That's we're seeing those.
They are seeing
Okay, they can see them now. Yeah.
All right, terrific. So in any case, our brief this evening is a pretty broad one, women and guns. And I found myself really struggling with how I wanted to address the topic in the relatively brief time I have allotted to me. And I think the reason that it was hard is that there are at least two distinct strands that fall under the rubric of women and guns, one of which is gun ownership by women, which I'll talk about, and the other of which is the risk posed by guns to women. And I was sort of kicking myself because I couldn't figure out a neat way to integrate them. But I guess realized ultimately that because their intention, that the best approach, or at least the approach I was going to take, is to take them in turn and then hope that the rest of the evening's presentations and our group discussion sort of will allow us from our various perspectives to start to think about how to integrate them into our work moving forward. Next slide, please. So, as to gun ownership among women, sort of to lay out the broad framework. It was only in 1980 that a survey called the General Social Survey started asking routinely and for the first time about personal gun ownership. And what they found was that despite press coverage and reports from gun industry trade groups like the National Shooting Sports Foundation that suggested that unprecedented numbers of women were buying guns over the period, in fact, from 1980 until about the mid-2010s, gun ownership among women was really remarkably stable at about 1 in 8 women. The contrast between those, the actuality and the claims actually led Tom Smith, the social scientist who ran the GSS, to say with a fair measure of exasperation to the online firearms journal, The Trace, that increasing gun ownership among women was a myth. Next slide, please. But perhaps not surprisingly, at least if you're a superstitious person like me, no sooner had Tom Smith said that gun ownership among women was stable than gun ownership overall, and particularly among women and people of color, really began to rise. And so, whereas in 2015, when we did a survey of US adults, we found, like the General Social Survey, that about 12% of women, or about 16 million women, said they own guns. By 2021, when we did another survey of, a nationally representative survey, we found that that fraction had risen to 20%, or about 25 million women gun owners, and an increase of 9 million guns over, six years or so. Next slide, please. And when we looked, as we did in our 2021 survey, as carefully as we could at new gun owners, so people who bought guns between 2019 and 2021, which was really just an artifact. Those dates are an artifact of when we did the survey. Don't have any greater meaning than that. When we looked at people who bought guns in that period who didn't have a gun at the time they bought their first gun, fully half of them, as you can see in the little red, I hope, in the little red squiggle in the middle of the screen, 47, almost 48% of them, so more than 3.5 million people, were women, such that about 13% of all women gun owners in 2021 had become a gun owner in the preceding 28 months. So, a really substantial shift, and consistent with the increase in the number of female gun owners I showed you on the last slide, that $9 million person jump. So next slide, please. So, what do these women gun owners look like? Well, it turns out that female gun owners, whether they're longstanding gun owners or new gun owners, really look like male gun owners in terms of all sorts of demographic characteristics, where they live, their, overall, how much money they make and the like. Although they're a little bit younger and a little bit more likely to own only handguns as opposed to both handguns and long guns, or long guns only. And new gun owners, again, both male and female, as I said before, are more likely to be not just women, but people of color and urban. But for the purposes of this talk, perhaps the most important way in which they're alike is that, like men and like handgun owners overall, female gun owners are overwhelmingly likely to say that the reason they own a gun is for protection. And when they're asked to specify, they say that it's protection against crime and protection against strangers, against people they don't know. Next slide, please. So what we know is that there are millions of women, largely out of a feeling that they need a gun to protect themselves and their loved ones, who are bringing guns, and increasingly bringing guns into their home. And yet what we also know, whether they be men or women, is that by having guns at home, not only do they substantially increase their own risk of suicide, but they also impose risk on the very people they seek to protect. Because when there's a gun in the household, when a person in a household owns a gun, all members of that household, including children, are at elevated risk, not just for suicide, though, though that risk is increased, is elevated 3 to 4-fold, but also, of domestic homicide, largely intimate partner homicide at the hands, by women, of women by their current or ex-partners, and especially for children, unintentional firearm injury. Next slide. So what we're left to think about, not just tonight, obviously, but more generally, is how we can resolve that tension between this, the instinct to protect that leads women to own guns and the actual risk imposed by those guns. It seems to me both to try to work towards a world in which women don't feel that they need a gun to protect themselves and their families because they feel and are safe, but also, and like this is the work I spend a lot of time doing, to better communicate to those women who choose to own guns or may be considering becoming a gun owner, the risks that are imposed by them when they bring guns into their homes, as well as the risks that are imposed on them and their children when there are guns in the household that don't belong to them. So I think I made it in my 6 to 8 minute frame, and thanks very much for your time. And I'm really looking forward to our next presentations and the discussion to follow.
Thank you so much, Deborah. That was really interesting and a great way to get started. Just wanted to mention that we are joined now by Greg Jackson, who I introduced earlier. Thank you for being here, Greg. It's great to see you. Next, we wanted to go to Chief Diaz to share his thoughts about kind of the problem and the conversation that we're talking about today around women and guns, and any thoughts or observations around that.
Yeah, so that's actually the stats that you just read off are actually in alignment with what we're actually seeing when it comes to the victimization of women. Right now we roughly see about close to about 37% to 38% of victims and violent crime that are female, and that includes anything from homicide to sexual assault to robbery and aggravated assault. And as we look at those numbers, we're actually seeing it rise and increase over the last couple of years, as we've seen all violent crime increase across the country and including in Seattle as well. And so right now, we're also seeing more gun recoveries than we've ever seen in the past. We're also seeing more guns being used in multiple incidents and multiple cases. And this year alone, we've recovered over 1,000 guns. We're actually almost recovering more guns than we had when we had 485 more officers. And so with less staff, we're actually doing a lot more gun recovery. And so we know that there was a lot of purchases in the previous 5 years. And as these guns are becoming more and more accessible to people in the public, and we are actually seeing more gun recoveries in Seattle as well. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Chief Diaz. Do you have any other thoughts about kind of the risk to women who have, like Deborah was talking about, who have guns in their homes, in terms of increases in suicides and things like that, and intentional shootings?
So that's one of the issues that we've been seeing. We've seen a lot of calls, calls for suicide, calls for people in crisis, behavioral crisis. I haven't broke down the numbers when it comes to females, but typically when you do see people in a crisis that are looking at harming themselves, having that access to a gun becomes a greater issue. And we've actually been doing a lot more extreme risk protection orders to try and make sure that we get guns out of the hands of people that are not in a good place, just mentally, and not in a, wanting to potentially harm themselves. And so that's a driving issue. But when we also look at, we're also encouraging people to make sure that they're doing everything they can to have safe storage of their firearms. Because right now, when we look at property crime like burglaries and car prowls, a couple of years ago, we looked at almost about 5,000 guns that were literally stolen anywhere from what we call the I-5 corridor from Portland all the way up to Vancouver. And so we know that a lot of these guns that we recover typically are guns that have been either stolen or from a burglary or from a car prowl. And so we want to make sure that we encourage people to lock their gun up and make sure that they're storing it safely as well.
There was a few questions around, and I had the same question. When you mentioned something about gun recoveries, what does that mean? Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so when an officer either goes to a call, either it could be a self-initiated call or it could be a 911 call, an officer ends up, either making an arrest on somebody and recovers a gun, or it's been used and left at a scene, or it could be that we are recovering the gun, say, such as an extreme risk protection order, where we're, we've had information that the person might, be a danger to themselves, and that we're recovering those guns to avoid them being harmful to themselves. So however, we're collecting those guns from a variety of different ways. Majority of those guns are being recovered for usually used in some level of criminal event. And so it typically is going to be in the homicide, it's going to be in the aggravated assault. In aggravated assault, what we do is we test every gun and every shell casing that we recover. And we want to make sure that we see and observe to see if it's been used in one case or multiple cases. And right now, out of all the guns that we've been recovered, about 36% is actually being used in multiple cases, and sometimes up to four plus incidents in the community.
And you had mentioned ERPOs, and when can you kind of explain that for the audience, and then also if you could say what the rate is of ERPOs in Seattle?
I'm sorry, the first part of the question was, I didn't hear that.
Just explaining to the audience about what the ERPOs are and how they're implemented, and also what the rate is of them.
Yeah, so extreme risk protection orders are typically, we go to court for an order to be able to take guns out. Typically, we have two different types of orders. One that's going to focus on domestic violence, or could be potentially used where we made an arrest and we need to recover more firearms from the house. Or the second one is, and this is where we come in contact with a lot more, and that's when people are experiencing some level of behavioral crisis. So you could have somebody that a family member calls and says, look, my father is now going through Alzheimer's. He has multiple rifles in the house. We would like to make sure that we safely, put him away so he doesn't harm himself or harm others. And so that might be an example of where we could be experiencing somebody potentially in behavioral crisis that couldn't, is unable to necessarily care for themselves. Or you could have the domestic violence situation where we're recovering firearms that are left in the house after we make an arrest. And so right now, percentage wise, typically we do recover about 100 guns a year associated with extreme risk protection orders, and we cover all sorts of anything from handguns up including to rifles as well.
And what happens to the guns after they're recovered? Like, where do they go?
So on extreme risk protection orders, people can, petition the court to acquire their guns back. Typically, the order is good for 1 year, and then we have to go and push for a renewal at the end of the year. When it's used in some level of criminal element, and we've, or there's no person that is associated with that gun, we do not burn them, but we melt them down, and they're not to be used in the public. And that is something that we worked very closely with the city council on creating an ordinance to make sure that those guns are not accessible back to the public.
Got it. Before we move on to the next panelist, is there anything else that you wanted to add that you didn't have a chance to say at the beginning?
No, I think one of the things that I do want to note is that what we've actually seen over the last couple of years is just this massive increase in the amount of guns that are out in our community. And just a couple of years ago, we were averaging around 320 shots fired a year, and now I've doubled that already this year alone. We've already had 633 shots fired this year, and we're again on pace to recover more guns out there. So this is where it's very concerning right now. this year alone, we've actually recovered over 2,700 shell casings. So imagine 2,700 shell casings and how much damage that can do in a community. And so these are where it keeps, it keeps me up at night, because, while we've seen our homicide rate increase, we've seen the amount of victimization increase, but we're also seeing females as being a product of that. I mean, we were averaging about 1,900 victims a year that were female in violent crime. And right now, last year we were at 2,200, and we'll surpass that this year already. So like what we see is the more victimization that's occurring among our females. And so we've got to figure out ways that we're trying to prevent and get guns off the streets, that we're trying to make sure that we're putting practices in place to make sure that women are also, like the Women's Violence Act, and that we're also making sure that we have laws on the books to ensure the safety of our women.
Thank you. And the questions from the audience have been coming through. Thank you all for that. I didn't need to encourage you. You were have lots of questions. This is great. Keep them coming. And if I didn't get to your question in the last few minutes, know that will be a quick Q&A at the end, and I'll be asking them then. So not to worry if your question wasn't answered at this particular moment. All right, so next we wanted to go to Greg Jackson. If you could just give us some opening thoughts.
Yes, well, good evening, everybody. I'm Greg Jackson, the Executive Director for Community Justice Action Fund. Just first and foremost, I just want to share, I got involved with this work not by choice, not by ambition, but by circumstance. In April of 2013, I was shot as an innocent bystander, and the bullet that hit me struck 2 arteries. And so I nearly bled to death. And I'll never forget that as traumatizing as being shot was and bleeding out on the pavement, when I was rushed to the hospital, I wasn't met with nurses and doctors and surgeons. I was met with investigators, and I had to go through 3 rounds of interrogation while I was fighting for my life. And I think that in itself was frankly probably more frustrating and traumatizing than the bullet. As I became more active in this space, I learned that's what Black and brown men and women go through every day. What we're seeing is criminals first and people second. And I think one of the major challenges in our country is that we look at violence in our country as a crime to solve as opposed to people to heal. And so that's a major reason why I stay involved and stay motivated. At Community Justice, we believe that the way that we end gun violence is by empowering and investing in those who are closest to the pain, and recognizing that violence is a public health issue and not necessarily a crime only issue. And unfortunately, we're one of the few voices that feel that way. I'm sure when you look on the media today in the 5 o'clock news, you'll hear about some traumatic shooting or incident, but as opposed to seeing the human side of what happened and the lives that are lost, you'll likely see police tape and blue and red lights and mugshots. And I think that is something that oversimplifies what is a very complex issue in our communities. As it pertains to gun violence and as it impacts women, we're actually, we have done a great deal of work in this area, but specifically to gun violence. If you just look at FBI data, every year over 600 women are shot or killed. And that means that every 14 hours, essentially, someone's being shot or killed. But for Black women, this means that they are twice as likely to lose their life to gun violence than a white woman. And gun violence has become the #2 cause of premature death for Black women under the age of 55. So a crisis that is not only surging, but is one of the leading causes of death. But when you look at gun violence, especially around the research, it's being highly under prioritized. In fact, gun violence is the least researched cause of death out of the top 30. And if you need a number for that, for every life that's lost to gun violence, there's about $590 that go into research to resolve that issue. But when you look at things like HIV, for example, for HIV, for every life lost, there's about $24 million that goes into research. So a huge discrepancy in us just exploring what the solutions are. And that data is based on a recent report on firearm injury research from the Center for Disease Control. But we do think that there are solutions that exist. From our perspective, we know that law enforcement and policing are part of the problem, but there are some other major ways that we can address this crisis that frankly have been under prioritized and overlooked. I think the first big thing is that we really need leaders and activists, the media and politicians to all recognize that this is more than just crime. In the Black community, for example, only 30% of gun-related homicides are connected to another felony crime. And so while, yes, the shooting itself is a crime, most of it is not derived from some other crime. So a lot of it is interpersonal conflict that gets out of hand between people who are not necessarily participating in any criminal activity. So we think the first big step is getting everyone to acknowledge this as a public health crisis and start to make a public health approach to this, which means an all of government approach that puts pressure on housing, our hospitals, our education system, our economic system, but really an all of government approach to address this crisis, just like we did with COVID, just like we're doing now with the opioid crisis and we've done in the past. Secondly, is that we do believe that there's a need to prioritize solutions that go beyond just the physical hardware and police responses. While we know there's an overwhelming surge in firearm ownership and purchasing, at this point, most of our communities are already saturated with firearms. And so only focusing on hardware dismisses the generations that are suffering right now. So we encourage more strategies that think beyond that. A couple examples of those strategies are strengthening resources and support for survivors of intimate partner violence or families and individuals who are women who are impacted by gun violence directly. And I know many of you may know about the Victims of Crime Act, but there are some huge breakdowns in those resources actually getting to victims. They did a study in the state of New York that found that only 4% of gun violence victims and or survivors were able to gain access from the Victims of Crime Act. And so we need to look at that funding source seriously and think about what are we doing to help resource victims directly. The second big thing is that there needs to be a strengthened investment in healthy relationship education and advocacy training programs, whether it's in the school or outside of the school, but how are we teaching and developing our young men and women around what a healthy relationship looks like, and doing that intentional and not just relying on what's happening in the home to achieve that goal. We also know that violence intervention programs are very successful, but very little of them have training around intimate partner violence de-escalation. And so we need to integrate that into all of our traditional violence intervention strategies, whether it's law enforcement or community-led. And then lastly, we need to make sure that we are strengthening any type of hospital-based support programs that are focused on treating those who have been impacted by violence, recognizing that law enforcement dependent responses may not have the same level of access to folks in Black and Brown communities. So those are just a few solutions I wanted to share. We actually have a policy playbook. It's called the Gender Policy Playbook on our website that you can download and read more on our perspective and frankly, some of the stats about how we see gun violence impacting our communities. But I think the biggest lesson that we want to just share is that this is more than a crime problem, especially in the Black community. And we have to make sure we fight back against the very harmful and dehumanizing stereotypes that are being pushed out there in our informing policy around gun violence. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Greg. I wanted to ask you real quick about one of the things that you said about, looking at it, not just a crime to solve versus people to heal. And I was really struck by that and wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that healing part and how your organization and others kind of tried to tackle that component of it. Yeah.
The best analogy we've kind of landed on is when you think about a public health crisis, there was two major ones that happened in most of our lifetimes that were handled differently. We saw with the crack epidemic, how that was handled with the crime approach to what was a public health crisis, which frankly, it deterred and suppressed the usage of crack cocaine. But this big major side effect was this huge wave of mass incarceration that destroyed and disrupted so many homes, which we frankly believe has led to this surge in gun violence that we're dealing with right now. But then if you look at the opioid crisis, where the accountability is not placed just on the individuals and the users, but it's placed more on those who are resourcing this harmful drug, and that a lot of the efforts when working with those directly impacted is focused on how do we heal them and how do we help them navigate out of a destructive lifestyle or destructive behavior. And we see violence as very similar. There are a host of programs that focus on behavioral therapy approaches for individuals that have a violent history. We also know that an easy way that we can help is just investing in victim services, because 40% of those who have been shot will be shot again, or worse, may kill someone within 5 years if not treated and supported through their recovery. So that's another way that we can heal those directly impacted. There are also, between hospital-based and street outreach programs that reach out to neighborhoods and communities that have been traumatized, that maybe have adopted a culture of violence out of survival. And these street outreach programs can work to de-escalate conflicts, but most importantly, start to push back on that harmful culture that violence is the way to resolve conflicts. So those are just a few examples. I mean, I think starting with intervention and those who have been directly impacted. And then the second major phase of kind of a people-centered approach is addressing the risk behaviors that lead to violence. So whether that's lack of resources, whether that's lack of opportunity, whether that's interpersonal conflict or a culture of interpersonal conflict. And then we believe that the third phase of a people-centered approach is really starting to pour some energy into the root causes that create these risk behaviors. And that's where you get into those bigger challenges, like inequitable housing situations or economic opportunity. And so intervention, address the risk factors that created those conflicts or feeding those conflicts, and then start to work on the root causes that breed the risk factors that lead to violence.
Thank you, Greg. And there was a question from the audience about the name of your organization, and then I had a question about where it's based.
Oh, yes. So we are the Community Justice Action Fund. You can call us Community Justice for short. And on our website, you can find us at www.cjactionfund.org, or on social media, we're just CJ Action Fund. We are a national focused organization, but we're based in Washington, D.C. But we do a lot of work in the South, in the Midwest, and the Northeast. But we'd love to partner with you all. So please feel free to reach out.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. And thanks for the great questions in the Q&A. All right. So Ralph, you have 10 minutes to give some opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Naomi. And boy, Greg, that was really impressive. I'm really excited to take a look at your website, but I'd like to thank Naomi and Margaret, for all the great work she does with grandmothers. And having been in a similar role in the past, I know it takes a lot of work. So Margaret, thank you very much for putting this together. I know, and Anthony Long and others at MOHAI. Thank you. My journey is, and I'll condense it, is after Columbine, I said, I've got to get involved in this. I'm from the East Coast. I had a liberal public health nurse mother, Kennedy-loving mother, and the school at Columbine was a lot like the school in the Sammamish Plateau my kids went to, and I said, oh my God, that could be us. And I got involved with Washington CeaseFire, and I met Ansel Payne, who was, some of you may know, was president of King 5, and Tom Wales. And Tom and I became best friends, and Tom tragically was shot 2 years later in his home, which is still, unfortunately, an unsolved crime. But I had an ad agency and sold it, and then the gun violence issue, I became obsessed with it and became my second mountain, if you will. And for 15 years, I focused on it virtually full time. And my epiphany moment was testifying for assault weapons ban when there were 500 people with loaded guns in the audience at the state capitol. So, and that's when I said, boy, this legislation thing is really tough. But I want to go back a little bit because Dr. Hemingway, Deborah's colleague at Harvard, he's the man on this issue. And he wrote the book, I think it's called Private Gun Public Health, that everybody should read, or which I think is a wonderful Bible for this. But real quick, and I think this kind of encapsulates the issue, and I like that Greg called this a public health issue, because we do have to address this. But Dr. Hemingway says there's 3 ways to address any public health issue, whether it's drunk driving or smoking or opioids. And one way is legislation. Obviously in drunk driving, that helped, but legislation is really tough nationally on this issue because you've got half the senators right off the bat that are in Republican states, and they're not going to push on this. I actually think President Biden did the very best he could do recently, and should be commended for that, but it's not going to move the needle that much. State legislation for certain states, I think, can work well. I live in California. I think they've done a great job there. I think Washington's done a great job. But even in Washington, you got rural sheriffs who aren't going to enforce, some of those laws. So national legislation is a lot of resources and effort put into that. And I don't think we've seen the results, and we're not going to see the results to the way we want. The other the other second way to address a public health issue is a public awareness campaign. To try to change behavior, and the drunk driving as a metaphor, friends don't let friends drive drunk. And that worked well as a component of an overall effort. But in guns, it's such a tribal emotional issue that half the audience is going to tune you out. Public awareness campaigns are unfortunately even limited on that. And that gets us into technology. And again, I'm going to quote Dr. Hemingway, who said, it's much easier to change the product than it is to change personal behavior. And I, after my 10th year on this issue, realized that technology was an answer, and that technology is a smart gun. And again, I'll go back to the drunk driving metaphor. Electronic rollover stabilizers have saved thousands of lives. When people are drunk, they tend to overreact. They drive erratically, and they're rollovers, and that's where people die. And electronic rollover stabilizers prevents that. So that's been wonderful. We have the same thing with smart guns, and they've been around and been in some form for 20 years. And the fact that they're not a reality is incredibly unfortunate. And real quick, a smart gun is a gun that can only be operated by the authorized user, and it's in the default position. And you use either RFID, radio frequency identification, a digital handshake, or biometric fingerprint to turn it from the default position into the on position. The technology works. It only costs about $50 more than a regular gun, but there's a lot of reasons why they aren't here, and I'll talk about that. But I want to tell you first, how they can save thousands of lives, not only for women, but for children. We have 45,000 gun deaths a year. When I started on this in 2000, there were 30,000, and we thought that was cataclysmic. Now we have 45,000, and the numbers are growing. But what doesn't get talked about is that 25,000 of those 45,000 are suicides. Now, I think Greg or Deborah was talking about the research that needs to be done that hasn't been done. It would be great if somebody could do the number of suicides that are using somebody else's gun, what we call third-party suicides. An underage youth, somebody in the family who doesn't own the gun. But long story short, we believe 10,000 of those suicide deaths by guns involve a third-party firearm. If you had a smart gun that could only be operated by the authorized user, a large chunk of those third-party suicides would go away. The other way smart guns could save lives, there are 5.4 million children who live in households with unlocked and loaded guns. I'll say that again, 5 million children under the age of 18 who live in households with unlocked and loaded guns. These are time bombs. And I want to relate this to women and guns. Well, there's nothing more relatable than the children of families. And, between child accidents and school shootings, smart guns would prevent all those. Smart guns could also, and Chief Diaz can relate to this, smart guns would significantly reduce the death and injuries in the 80% of firearm crimes that involve stolen guns. Any gun with used in a crime, a high likelihood it is a stolen gun because the criminals don't want to be traced. If they had a smart gun that was inoperable in their hands, that would have a significant drop on that. It could reduce school shootings involving instances like Columbine that were perpetrated by somebody under the age of 18. And then last but not least, you get 70 women a month in this country that are killed by an intimate partner with a gun. And in many cases, it's a woman has a gun and there's a gun grab involving that. It gets taken away and then it's used against her. If a woman who felt compelled to have a gun, and we all recognize the safest situation is a home without a gun, and all the stats are there, and we all advocate for that. But people still feel they need to have a gun. If a woman feels that she needs to have a gun, then certainly a smart gun could save a lot of lives. I'm going to cut this reasonably short, but why aren't guns currently available? Well, it goes back to 2000. Bill Clinton and the Smith & Wesson CEO worked together to produce a smart gun. There was such blowback from the gun community that the CEO was fired. There was a boycott of Smith & Wesson. Smith & Wesson stock went down 80%, and that all prevented any current gun manufacturer from producing a gun. The other reasons of that, there was a popular gun called Armitex, or the first real RFID gun in 2014 by a German company called Armitex and a fellow named Ernst Mach, who worked on military guns. I've got to know him. He's a remarkable person, but that smart gun was way too complicated and way too expensive for the average user. And it also ran into something called the New Jersey smart gun mandate. New Jersey, had a well-intentioned law that said all guns sold in the state of New Jersey must be smart guns. Unfortunately, that had tremendous blowback, as you can imagine. We, Washington CeaseFire, worked with the Speaker of the House, Loretta Weinberg, to repeal that mandate, in part because we had done research that showed there was tremendous appeal, particularly among women in gun-owning households with children. 83% of women in gun-owning households wanted to swap out their gun for a smart gun, in part to protect their children. So smart guns don't have to be legislatively mandated, particularly among gun-owning households with children. 83% of those want a smart gun. The good news is we've got research that shows people will pay more than $200 for a smart gun because of its life-saving benefits. The research also showed that you put childproof in smart guns in advertising, and the price goes up 10%. So the safety benefit is amazing. But then we had some unfortunate things that happened. We've always had strong support from Harvard Public Health and Deborah and Dr. Hemingway. But one of the other strongest proponents was a fellow named Stephen Tourette from Johns Hopkins University. Johns Hopkins is very important because Michael Bloomberg went to Johns Hopkins. He invested $100 million, Johns Hopkins School of Health. Stephen Tourette was a keynote speaker at a smart gun symposium CeaseFire sponsored back in 2016. At that time, Stephen Tourette said, for every gun that a smart gun every death that a smart gun would cause, we'd save 1,000 lives. The argument for the danger of smart guns is that they would increase the appeal of guns and you increase the percentage of homes with guns in them. So, and we don't want that to happen. Anyhow, Stephen Tourette moved on. We did new research that showed that there's popularity among households with children with guns, and Johns Hopkins felt that smart guns wouldn't succeed, could be more dangerous because they would increase home gun ownership. We vociferously, complained about that. You could have cities do trade-ins for guns. You could do public health campaigns, but that hurt the movement quite a bit. And then in closing, I just want to say that I believe smart guns are our best option for reducing gun violence. Venture capitalists aren't going to invest in it. They're not going to invest in the in the gun industry. We do have champions in addition to Deborah and Dr. Hemingway. Ed Stack, the former CEO of Dick's Sporting Goods, which has 700 stores, which outlawed guns, said they would stock a smart gun in every one of their stores. If they once they became commercially available. It's the technology is available. This is not a massive investment. I no longer am involved in a smart gun company, although I started one, but it frankly, we ran out of money.
Ralph, I'm sorry, I gotta interrupt you for a second. I know Chief Diaz has to leave in about
Okay.
3 minutes, so I just wanted to.
Naomi, I just want to say one last thing because I'm right there. The other good thing, I'm sorry, a Canadian lawsuit, reason for optimism, involving Smith & Wesson that's currently in motion would mandate smart guns for Canada. We don't have the same liability laws. So lots of reasons for optimism.
Okay, Chief Diaz, I know you have to leave in like a minute, but I wanted to ask you just real quick, if you can, if you have an explanation for the increase in the number of guns in society, and also what we're doing with gun collection and centering the need to get guns out of the hands of people with mental health issues and people who have committed crimes.
Yeah, and I think when we see the amount of guns that have been purchased over the last several years, that's really the driving force, I think, why we're seeing a lot more guns out in the streets. And as I mentioned, we're seeing about about a third of those guns that are being stolen, and in some level of either burglary or car prowl, because people are not necessarily locking them up and putting them in some level of safe storage. When it comes to the second question, we look at it from a 5-part approach. So as Greg mentioned, we have been 100% supportive of, getting violence interrupters into the mix of it. I've actually started doing a lot of work and started actually working with violence interrupters or the concept of violence interrupters back in 2008, after we had 5 young men that were shot and killed in the city of Seattle. We actually worked with the collaborative Columbia High Shaw collaboration that was in DC. We worked with a variety of different organizations to actually build a model over here in Seattle. And now there is the regional peacekeeper work. There's also the Credible Messenger. There's also Community Passageways. There's a variety of different organizations that are doing a lot of great work in this field. And so that's really important for make sure that you have a community driver that's really trying to find solutions inside community. The second is that we take a look at looking at analytics. So we do the hotspot policing, where we're looking at areas where there's a lot of gun violence, and why are those the drivers of those gun violence. But it's also looking at those that are that have been using the firearms and been preying on the community. And so we know that, as I kind of mentioned, we look at all the gun casings and all the guns that we recover, and we're analyzing to see, have they been used in multiple incidences. And right now, roughly about 30%, about 35% are being used in multiple cases. And so, which is typically one person literally, involved in multiple shootings. And we actually just had our recent homicide of the postman. Actually, the gentleman that shot and killed him had been involved in several different cases that we're now, working on and investigating, and hopefully, being able to bring some closure to the families that have been impacted by the gun violence. So we want to make sure that we're really targeting our efforts on those that are preying on the community. The third one is that we do look at prevention. So we look at, safe storage, we look at gun laws, we look at, extreme risk protection orders. We look at a variety of ways that we can make sure that we're getting guns out of the hands of people that might be harmful to the community or harmful to themselves. And doing it in a measure of, a legal measure of making sure that we're, using legislation to be able to take those guns on the streets. The fourth item is we look at environment. So we want to make sure an area is well lit. We want to make sure that an area has the brush cut back. We want to make sure that people are utilizing that area, that there's not dark spaces, that there's not a propensity for crime to occur because the environment feels dilapidated or it feels unsafe. And so you have to look at an environment, and we look at environments throughout the whole city to try and make sure that we're revitalizing those areas and trying to make sure that they're safe because of how that environment feels for people walking in that neighborhood. And then the fifth part is enforcement. And so, we look at it, not just as for us, in a police department, we do look at enforcement because it is a driver of making sure that we're getting guns off the streets, that we're actually, tackling those that are actually preying on the community and that are harming the community. And so we do want to make sure that we're focused on that effort. We're not just put in a blanket level of enforcement and just going out and arrest everybody. We actually really want to target those that are actually doing or have that propensity for violence. And so, you know, we use a lot of different avenues of making sure that we're focused on those efforts. And it's not easy because, you know, a part of that is that as you work with community and as you start to, you know, uncover a lot of issues that are going on, you're also trying to make sure that, you know, and I've actually since, you know, back in 2004, when I started doing a lot of the youth violence prevention work, we've actually focused our efforts on a public health model. And, you know, we've actually been working with a lot of different organizations to really drive that. But we also have to make sure that those that are harmful to the community, that there is a timeout avenue, that there is a time where people are held accountable for those that are harming our community. And so it's that balance between both. We want to make sure that we're restoring people into the community and that we're making sure that there are good solutions that are community driven. But we also have to make sure that the community is safe from that level of violence as well.
Thank you, Chief Diaz. And do you have time for one more question, or do you need to take off? One more question?
One more question.
Okay. So one of the audience questions was, why haven't police advocated for more gun safety legislation?
You know, I actually have been a part of the Alliance for Gun Responsibility. I've actually testified on many different initiatives, anything from ghost guns, safe storage. You know, right now, we also want to make sure that our city has the ability to put in legislation for and put in rules at the city level to, you know, make sure that the city is safe of guns. And I think that there is legislation, hopefully, you know, in this next legislative cycle that allow the mayor to make, and working with the legislative body to be able to do that. So we've actually, you know I've been in Olympia and have testified several times, but that I can't tell for other chiefs. But to me, this has been an important area of really making sure that we're responsible, that that we have a level of gun responsibility when it comes to legislation.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
can I-
Yeah,
Can
go
I add
ahead.
something to that? I will just say, you know, law enforcement has been a huge advocate for gun safety and gun prevention measures federally. When I was able to testify before Congress, right before the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, right next to me was the chief of police in Buffalo, New York. And they echoed and in some areas were more enthusiastic about the need for change. I will say nationwide, we have a whole collection of law enforcement leaders that are rallying and supporting us. What I have noticed though is that they're willing to let the community drive the narrative, and I think that's an important place to be, especially in a world where policing as a whole can be seen controversial, and police reform is something that becomes the center of attention. And what we've seen is law enforcement has been respectful to allow, or really to empower, community to lead the conversation and not let it become dominated by how policing should be done, but more about how we address the crisis overall. So just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Greg. And Chief Diaz, you have to leave right now.
I do. So thank you for your time. I really apologize I couldn't stay longer. I know I was a fill-in, but I really do appreciate your time and the discussion. I think it's very meaningful.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much. All right. So now we're going to go to, we've already been getting lots of great questions from the audience, so keep those coming. But now we're going to go to just kind of a conversation amongst the panelists. Well, first I wanted to ask you, any thoughts or reactions to what anyone else has said that you want to share? Deborah, if you're speaking, you're on mute.
I'm muted. I am
Okay.
speaking, but and now I'm no longer muted. I'm interested, Greg, in whether or not you have any sort of thoughts about, one of the things that we've found about increasing gun ownership among women and among people of color and markedly among African-American women, and just sort of how we should be thinking about that in the mix of all of the other things that are going on.
Yeah, funny enough, last week we did, I participated in this Vice News filming, should come out in January. It was all gun owners and then myself. and a couple other advocates, about 3 advocates and 6 gun owners, and most of them were women of color. And I think what has happened is that we have allowed the gun industry to control and define what being safe means. And that's a huge problem and a huge thing to break down. There's a lot of emotion that's connected to purchasing a gun, and not necessarily logic. And what we failed at doing was really breaking down, not we, I mean, I think everyone who's concerned about this is really breaking down how can you prevent yourself from being harmed. And as someone who's been shot, you know, I know firsthand if I had a gun on me, that would not have saved my life. If anything, it would have cost me my life, because I would have maybe hesitated in evading. I would have maybe tried to fight this person in a gunfight and would have been killed. You know, I would probably have been shot in the chest instead of the leg. And I think a lot of people don't have those lived experiences. All they have is what you see in the movies, these big shootouts, or somebody who's getting revenge and grabs a shotgun off their porch and goes and find their loved one. And that's really a reckless and unreal picture of how gun violence is. It happens within seconds, if not minutes. And you can't, a gun is not the way to defend yourself. Usually by the time the gun is drawn, it's too late. And so what we're trying to do is really, at this stage, one, make sure people who are purchasing have some equitable access to safety measures. So training, storage, education on the risks of gun violence or gun ownership, because we have seen a huge inequities around that. Some research we've done is that the majority of people who gain education around responsible gun ownership gain that from law enforcement, but there's a huge breakdown between Black communities and law enforcement. So how do we create other sources to educate people on responsible gun ownership? And then how do we teach people about how to defend their homes or their families in a better way? And the importance of known deterrence versus unknown deterrence. And that if someone doesn't know you have a gun on you, that doesn't make you safer until the conflict begins. But a known deterrent could prevent a conflict from happening in the first place. So that's something that we're starting to work more on. I would love to partner with more folks, especially, you know, folks at Harvard. If we could do a whole study on ways to deter violent conflict and then start educating people, I think that would be huge. And we need like security companies and the SPCA, knowing that dogs are a known deterrent, right? Like all of those entities and industries should all be leaning in on this messaging to fight back this gun as a first resort kind of narrative that the gun industry has brainwashed Americans with, you know. But we know that it's not the only way to make us safe. If anything, it's the last resort. But there's not even a counter narrative out there. It's just don't have a gun, which is silly. So we would love to work with you all more on that. And I think if folks have ideas, I'm open to it.
I will follow up.
Thanks so much. Any other thoughts or reactions before we move on to some of the audience?
Naomi, I want to bring up the point about guns and suicide and women, because one of the things I think Deborah brought up is that women suicides are increasing as women gun ownership is increasing. It doesn't get the attention it deserves. You know, it represents, I don't know, 5/9 of all the deaths. And we have to, as a public health issue, put more attention on suicide. Even the two major, this is one of my major frustrations, and it's a frustrating issue. The two major suicide groups don't even talk about guns. Suicidology, the American Suicide Foundation. Guns represent a majority of suicides, you know, and the two major organizations committed to that. Now they say they will, but you have to go on like the 12th page. Don't even talk about guns and suicide. And I've asked them about that, and they said, well, our advisors say that if we talk about suicide on our legislative agenda, we won't get everything else passed. But when guns are your primary, issue on suicide, you think they would talk about that. So we need to talk more about suicides because they affect everybody's situation, and they are the majority of all gun deaths. But we talk about school shootings, rightly so. We talk about criminal acts, rightly so. But we have to talk more about suicide and ways we can prevent that. I do think smart guns are a partial solution to that, but there has to be more discussion around it.
And I wanted to go back to the question about smart guns. We had several questions from the audience about, just what is a smart gun? How do you get one? Why are we promoting them? And then there's a follow-up question after that, if you can kind of start with that, Ralph.
Yeah, as I mentioned, a smart gun is a gun that can only be fired by the authorized user. They're not available now. They're technology feasible, but they're not available because, as I know in the case of Lodestar, we couldn't get funding for it. But I don't know if you can see on my finger here, I have a synthetic ring, and this is RFID version. You could put a chip in there, and there's a chip in the gun, and basically a digital handshake, you hold the gun like this, and when the chip here and the chip in the gun are within 6 inches of each other, the gun goes from the default off position to the on position. So it's pretty safe and seamless, you know, to operate. Now, if it got in the hands of a child or a criminal who didn't have both components, it wouldn't work. The other version is called biometric. That's fingerprint. It doesn't work as well. It doesn't work outside. Silicon Valley likes it because it's kind of the iPhone approach to it. Moisture can affect the authentication on it. So, you know, I'm pretty agnostic on what worked, and we felt RFID was a much better way. Smart guns could be available in 2 years. And they would be, and we know the research shows they could be very popular, but there has to be this pushback, whoever manufactured this, to say, you know, the safest home is one without a gun. We don't want you to buy this product, but if you're going to buy a gun, it should be a smart gun, particularly if you have children in your home.
Does anyone know the percentage of guns in circulation that are like legally registered versus ones that aren't?
No, I don't.
I mean, almost no place has registration. I mean, so we estimate that there, I mean, 2021, we had an estimate that there are on the order of 345 million guns in circulation and in sort of civilian hands. There are clearly some guns over and above that people aren't going to tell you about on a survey, but there's no way to, it's hard to estimate those. I mean, what we do know, for example, and this, you know, this is responsive to Ralph, we know that, you know, between 300 and 500,000 guns are stolen every year, you know, and where those guns go and, you know, at what point they may enter a, you know, a gray market or a black market for guns and, you know, travel up and down, you know, the East Coast corridor or the West Coast corridor is also needs to be better understood. I mean, the other thing I would just in response, you know, again, a little bit about smart guns is that a really striking feature. We did a study where we were able to talk to, you know, an adult and a teenager in a home, you know, talking about, you know, and what we found was that, you know, in about, you know, not only did lots of kids know how to access a gun that their parents thought they couldn't, but even more striking, you know, about 20% of parents of adolescents, gun owners, said that their child had access to that gun. And, you know, and so the question is sort of, I mean, there's a secondary thing we need to do around sort of smart gun technology or anything we do to reduce the, you know, to improve firearm storage, which is to convince people or to make the case that authorized users don't need to include everybody in the family. You know, the kids aren't better off if they have access to a gun. And so that's a difficult challenge.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. You know, one of the frustrating things, and just real quick here about smart guns, is not only do we get pushback from the right. I mean, some people on the right think the government's going to put this GPS chip and be able to know where your gun is all the time on a smart gun, and they could invalidate the operation of that gun. But there are even people on the left who don't want a safer gun to be the solution, you know, to reducing gun violence. They don't want a partial solution. There's still people that live in a bubble. They want all guns to go away, which would be great. We all want that, but that's not going to happen. And it's one reason why I have tremendous respect for the Brady Group, you know, tremendous respect. But I asked the people there, and I've worked closely with them, said, why aren't you guys being outspoken proponents of smart guns? And the hardcore honest truth that everybody whispers, but they don't want to know, is that there are significant donors out there who are against them because they don't want safer guns. The Giffords organization, to its credit, is the one organization pushing for smart guns. But even Michael Bloomberg, who's the ultimate pragmatist, isn't in favor of smart guns because of the reinterpolation of data, which I think is silly at Johns Hopkins. So this is such, if you're in the issue, in this issue, you live and breathe it for 20 years like Deborah has, or I have, and others, why aren't smart guns the first step? Why can't we reduce 10 to 20% of the deaths in a 3-year span? This is bipartisan, a free market choice. The research supports it. The technology is available. God damn it, let's at least do this.
I want to steer us back a little bit to the women angle and ask Deborah a question from the audience, which was, I guess it's not necessarily women, but asking if you know anything about pink pistols and why LGBTQ women are buying guns.
Specifically, I mean, no, I know, I know of those organizations. I don't have any reason to think that LGBT, that gay women or anybody else is more likely or less likely than anybody else to say that they want a gun for protection, whatever they mean by that. I imagine that dominates, I think there's a miscalculation there, but clearly there's a widespread notion among both men and women that the reason you need a gun is for protection against, as I said, against intruders to your home, against strangers, and what gets missed in that is the danger that you bring into your home and that you risk by, having a gun that may be stolen. Yeah.
Deborah, you and David had the key statistic, I think, and it is that when there's a gun in the home, right, it's like 18 times more likely to kill a family member or a friend than an intruder, 5 times more likely to have a completed suicide. So I'm one of those who wish all guns would go away, but I'm also a pragmatist and strong proponent of at least a partial solution.
Absolutely. I agree with you. I think some of the most compelling evidence, you want to know a sort of policy proposal that I think would really help us understand a lot of things better. In California, there's point of purchase, there's point of sale record keeping, and it's in effect, a registration of handguns. And so what's been happening, because those data have been available to share with researchers, is that my colleague Matt Miller and David Studdard at Stanford have done extraordinary work recently showing that when somebody brings a handgun into a home that doesn't have one, the risk of suicide for male gun owners and female gun owners, goes up by a factor of 5 or 6 or 7. The risk of that, if someone other than if a gun is brought into a home, a handgun is brought into the home, that the cohabitant, usually a woman, her risk of suicide goes up dramatically, as likely the risk of her children. And that when a man brings a gun, when a gun is brought into the home, a home that doesn't have one, women are at 7 times elevated risk of domestic homicide. Really, so the our ability to sort of really nail down important questions, really is sort of secondary to having decent data about what's going on and knowing where guns are and knowing what's happening. And so that, I think that's an important.
I want to jump in too. I think one thing that's real is Americans don't pay attention to research. Think about it.
What do you mean?
Everybody wants to lose weight, but how many of us went and studied the CDC reports on the best ways to lose weight? No, we typically bought a Peloton or we got some waist slimmer from Marshall's, we just, or we go eat keto because we heard that was cool. But we don't pay attention to the data. I think a lot of what happens is we're emotional beings and we're especially emotional. We're impulse buyers. And a lot of those impulses, I think, are driven by media and public opinion. And we're not holding media accountable. I think that's another big part of this picture is that we have to hold media accountable to how they perceive violence. And they have to tell the story. I think for us, they don't tell the story all the way through. They say 4 people shot this weekend in blank city. They don't say, oh, this child accidentally shot himself because the mother didn't lock it up. Or, oh, this dispute spiraled and it was actually the husband's gun that did it. We aren't telling the full story. We're just giving these very raw stats and this very criminal only picture, and where people I think are their fear is criminal activity, and they're putting that fear ahead of any logic. And we either have to try to disrupt that fear, or we have to pump this logic into people's faces like we did with cigarettes, to get people to really understand the risks. And those who do smoke are looked at as dumb because they're harming themselves. Like, we have to either overload them with data, or we've got to disrupt like this misinformation. Because I can have the best debate with anybody, but I don't feel like other than a few legislators, I can barely convince my own family. And I've been studying this for 10 years, because they get so emotional,
Yeah. Well, Greg, it's a very complex issue because it's like cancer. It isn't monolithic. There's all sorts of aspects. There's suicide that we talked about. There's gun accidents, child shootings. There's gun grabs. There are, criminal guns, violent acts. There are, the school shootings, and each one has a different genesis to it. And what I found is most politicians like to ride the wave to support this issue, but very few really know it in depth to do something critical. So we have to have separate issues for suicide, separate for, underprivileged communities, separate for school shootings and the whole bit. And it takes a lot of work. And there are stars out there, but I wish like a Michael Bloomberg, who is a hero. We should all worship him, but I wish he spent $50 million on a public health campaign just spouting off about the key data that, Deborah and David Hemingway come up there about the dangers of a gun in the home. That'd be a great place to start, because we spend a lot of money on this issue. And I know what you said, but overall it's still a lot of money. 50 million, I think, people know the facts, like you have a gun in the home, you're 5 times more likely to have committed suicide, I think could save some lives at least. Because right now what we're doing isn't working.
Yeah, as long as we include why you shouldn't be anti-gun, and here are the alternatives.
Yeah.
We keep missing the alternative side.
It's going to be crafted in a public health issue, which I think we all agree on. I think your spiel was dead on. I think, Deborah comes at it from public health. I've learned to come at it from public health. We can take the politics out of it, but I don't know if the other side is going to let us do that to some extent. That's why I believe the first step can be a technology solution and maybe some sort of public health awareness building.
And to that point, we have a great question from an audience member for, Polly, Deborah, or Greg, to follow up on some of the things you were saying, Greg. They're asking what work is being done to better understand what's causing women to feel so fearful that they need to have a gun for protection from strangers, and then not actually focusing on the fact that they're more likely to suffer harm from their people in their own family or people they know. Like, how is that education coming out to the public?
It's a good question. There certainly are. So there are organizations that are focused on trying to make the case, sort of using, social media influencing kind of models to make sort of make the case that kids shouldn't, don't want to become gun owners. There's that sort of work, sort of following along in the kind of work that got done with cigarettes to try to keep kids from starting to smoke. Sort of similar efforts in the gun world. There's certainly a lot of clinical medicine work, that clinicians who are talking to patients less maybe about not having guns, but certainly about reducing access to guns to vulnerable people at times of high risk. So people who are, going through a really difficult time, or, they have a substance abuse problem, or a domestic, having trouble in their relationship and the like. And I hope, we're going to do a survey again, not that surveys are the be all and end all, but we'll do another survey in 2023. One of the things we'll really try to focus on is digging deeper and maybe in a more open-ended way into what people say about why they got guns. Although, I think as Greg says, that knowing that it's about protection is sort of, only takes you so far, and thinking about fear and thinking about how you might promote alternative ways, how you can fill that need in ways other than having a gun, I think, it certainly need to be developed.
Anything you want to add to that, Greg?
I mean, yeah, I just, I think there's not enough being done in that space, to be honest, and so just want to acknowledge that. I mean, there are organizations that are doing it and starting it. I think there's a lot of work around domestic violence, specifically intimate partner violence specifically, but a lot of it doesn't tie in the impact of gun ownership. And I think Ralph kind of spoke to it already. The gun violence movement is very driven by mass shooting activists. And so you'll see a lot of the policy proposals being connected to mass shooting strategies, which overlooks kind of this major epidemic of violence against women and loss of life due to gun violence against women. So it's definitely, at least, especially in the Black and Brown community, it's been a big gap that we're trying to help fill. But we're also, we're a small organization. And so I think for us, it's going to take organizing other bigger advocacy groups like the NAACP, Color of Change, Movement for Black Lives, some of these groups, really just educating them on what role they can play and hoping that they'll carry that water for us a little bit.
And I know we're almost out of time, and apologies to the audience that we didn't get to all of your questions. There's so many of them and they're so excellent. It's a very engaged and informed audience. So thank you so much for that. And I know all the folks in this panel are accessible in one way or another too, if you have follow-ups for them. But I do want to just kind of close with asking Margaret to talk a little bit about the work that your organization's doing, both in terms of the research that you're funding, as well as the efforts to make a difference on the rising gun violence that Grandmothers is working on.
Well, yes, thank you, Naomi, and deep thanks to each of you for your excellent comments and presentations and perspectives this evening. I am excited, Deb, to start to get to know you and to support enthusiastically on a personal level and an organizational level the research you all are doing, because we, Grandmothers Against Gun Violence Foundation, as you may know, is committed to funding research. We made our first gift, I think it was 2018, and we've made 5 donations, 5 contributions, all through the University of Washington, primarily, but not exclusively, the School of Public Health, and often to Ali and a graduate student or an early career colleague of his. And we're very pleased to be able to do that. And we thank people in the audience who are donors to the foundation that enable us to do that. We will continue our work. And I think we're quite taken with what could be an alternative narrative to women other than the quick turn to the gun to handle the very real feelings of fear and apprehension. As Chief Diaz spoke, women have been victims forever and looked to ways to protect against victimization. Right now, it seems to be the quick turn to the gun, but a great area for development is what are the alternatives, as each of you has spoken, and what is the alternative narrative to give to women. Grandmothers works on a number of different ways in addition to our support for legislation. We are advocates primarily at the state level, but we've been active, as Greg knows, on the federal level this year, working on a child access prevention law called Ethan's Law, and working now to get the assault weapons ban bill brought up for a vote in the US Senate. It will probably come up in the Washington State Legislature in the 2023 session, and we will be making noise about that. We also do a lot of public education, a lot of programs, because we believe that the informed citizen is more likely to be the active citizen. If you have an understanding of the issue, if you have some feeling of fluency with the issue, you will talk about the issue. You will use your voice. You will stand up and speak up. So we are also, though, I'm very taken with this technology idea, we are also looking at what are other approaches than legislative solutions and even public health awareness campaigns. Two very important pathways, but there's got to be another pathway. There's got to be a place where we can figure out how to make it not cool to have an unstored gun in your home. We've got to take a look at the sale of toy guns to children and what kind of comment that is on what we're saying to kids, how we're maybe reinforcing some notions about guns. So we want to affect sociocultural change as well as legislative change. We want to support research, advocate, and look for ways to change how we think about and own guns in this country. So thank you for asking, and thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi.
We would like to ask Leonard Garfield, who's the executive, right? There we go. Thank you. Hello, Leonard.
Hello, Margaret. Wow. Thank you to all the panelists and Naomi for the masterful facilitation. To all of the guests, we had 115 people on the line, and I not only heard problems articulated, I think I saw some potential solutions and collaborations and partnerships. I heard that among the panelists. So I'll look forward to hearing that moves forward. I just want to thank Grandmothers Against Gun Violence for all the work that you have done for so many years on reducing gun violence through your direct action, through your education, through your legislative efforts, and through your outreach. Margaret knows this well, and some folks on the call know this as well, but one of MOHAI's core strategic goals is to be a catalyst for learning, a catalyst for community, and a catalyst for conversation. And these grand conversations, of which we've now had 3, and I look forward to more in the future, are exactly the kind of thing that, of all things, a history museum wants to do. Because if we don't come together and learn from these experiences, even the recent experiences of just this week, we will never really move forward to a better future. So that's what our goal is. If you do want to know more about Grandmothers Against Gun Violence, what a fabulous website, and it's just that, thoseverywords.org. And the Museum of History and Industry is very simple, MOHAI, MOHAI.org. We invite you to visit both those websites and do become members if what we're doing aligns with what your interests are as well. So Margaret, thank you again. Thank you, grandmothers. Thank you, panelists and Naomi. And of course, we also thank the Chief for joining us this evening. And hope you have a great evening, everyone. And with that, I think we're going to sign off. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Ralph. We'll talk later.